All right, so the second type of compound inequalities is called an AND. So you can see the difference is instead of having arrows going to the left and going to the right, this would be an OR. You have your inequality is graphed in between. So if it's in between, it's an AND. In between is AND. So this one is always written like this. You always take the number that it starts with, so it starts with -2, and then give a big space, then you give the number that it ends with. It ends with 5. And your symbols are always going to go in this direction. So in this case, you're always going to have two inequality symbols when you're writing an AND inequality, and they're always going to go in that direction. And so you're always going to have this symbol, you're going to put an X, and you're always going to have that symbol. They're always going to be in that direction. Then all you have to do is you have to look back and say, okay, at -2, it's a closed circle, so therefore I need to include the line underneath. But at 5, it's an open circle, so I don't need to include the line. So this would be my answer. And then in interval notation, it's actually much easier. You could equal -2, then it goes to 5, but you can't equal 5, so it's a parenthesis. So again, AND inequalities will always have two inequality symbols. The X will always be in the middle. The symbols will always be going in this direction. And then you just basically say, where does it start? Where does it end? And then add a line underneath if you have a closed circle. So we already rewrote it a lot of times. So sometimes you see the word AND in between. But the proper way is you never see the word AND. You just have it as one big inequality. So this is, instead of saying the word AND, we already wrote the answer. And I'm not even going to show you the other way because the other way is really not correct. All right. So see how you see the word AND? So a lot of times, you never actually see that word. Most of the time, I'm not even going to do this question because this is not the type of question I'm going to give you. You're going to see it written more like question number 9. So like question number 9, you could see it's one big inequality. You have two inequality symbols. And because you don't see the word or, you know it's an and inequality. Like it clearly doesn't say the word or, so I know it's an and inequality. So I know it's going to be shaded in between at the very end. So here's what you do. You kind of split this up. Like I'm going to do -2 less than or equal to a minus 1. That's my first inequality I need to solve. My second inequality is I basically cover up the first part, and then I take a minus 1 less than or equal to 6. So I have two different inequalities. The first time I covered up the less than or equal to 6. Then the second time I covered up the -2 less than or equal to. And so those are my two inequalities. You have to set it up like that every single time. Now I could solve it. So I would add 1, and I'm left with -1 less than or equal to a. Then I add 1, and I'm left with a less than or equal to 7. So this is super weird because the variable is on the right-hand side. So here's the easiest way to figure this out. We know it's an and, right? So we know our final answer should be written somewhat like this or somewhat like this, right, with the x in between. And so all you do is which number is bigger? 7. Which number is smaller? -1. So I'm going to start by rewriting. I'm going to put my smaller number first and my bigger number last. I'm going to put an x in between. I'm always going to have these symbols. And then at -1, there was a line underneath. Or I guess they're using a instead of x, so I guess that should be an a. That's my mistake. But then also at 7, you have a line underneath. So if you think about it, if you read it this way, if you read it with the a first, this is the same thing as saying a is greater than or equal to -1. Then this is the same thing as saying a is less than or equal to 7. So x, or a, is greater than or equal to -1, and x is less than or equal to 7. So again, if that's confusing, just know that because it's one big inequality, it's and. You split up your two inequalities, you solve for each, you put your smaller number, you put your bigger number, you always put the symbols in that direction, and then you go back and see if you have a line underneath. So at -1, I have a closed circle, and then at 7, I have a closed circle, and I'm going to shade in between those two circles. So my answer in interval notation, because they're both closed, is -1, 7 with brackets. All right, so I'm going to do a few more to see how you set these up. So look at question 10. Again, it doesn't say the word or, and it has two inequality symbols. So if it has two inequality symbols and it doesn't say the word or, I know right away it's an and inequality. And so here's what I do. I split it up, and I do 4 less than 3p plus 4. So the first time I cover up the ending, and I just write that down, 4 less than 3p plus 4. Now the second one, I cover up the first, and I do 3p plus 4 less than 19. So that's how I set it up every single time. Cover up the one at the end, do that first inequality. Cover up the one at the beginning, rewrite that inequality. So now I have two inequalities that I need to solve. And so I subtract 4, I get 0 less than 3p, I divide by 3. 0 divided by anything is just 0. No need to flip the sign. So we have p is greater than 0. You always have to read it with the variable first. So p is greater than 0. I know we usually are familiar with reading this with the number or the variable on the left side, but you always read the inequality with the variable first, so p is greater than 0. Then I subtract 4 on this side. The good part about these is that the first step will always be the same. I subtracted 4, I subtracted 4. For this inequality, I do the same thing. I subtract 4 and I subtract 4. So I'm left with 3p is less than 19 minus 4 is 15. I divide by 3, p is less than 5. So I know that it's an and inequality just because how it's written, right? It's one big inequality. I don't see the word or. So I know it's going to be shaded in between, right? It's going to be shaded in between. It's not going to be the two arrows going to the left and to the right, right? Two arrows going to the left and to the right. This has to do with or. In between is an and. So to write my final answer, my smaller number is 0, my bigger number is 5. I put my variable in between, which this time is p. I always have my symbols going this way. And then I look. At 0, there's no line underneath, so I keep it like that. At 5, there's no line underneath, so I also keep it like that. So then I just go ahead and plot it. At 0, I have an open circle. At 5, I have an open circle, and then it's shaded in between. So then my my interval notation is just 0 to 5 with two parentheses, and that's it. All right, I'll do one more. And so here we have, it's an and, we have two inequality symbols. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover up the last one, and I'm going to write that down. 28 greater than -2 minus 10m. So I'm going to do 28 greater than -2 minus 10m. Then I'm going to cover up the beginning one, and I'm going to do -2 minus 10m greater than or equal to -7. So those are my two inequalities that I have to solve. I'm going to add 2. I'm going to add 2. I get 30 is greater than negative 10m. This time I'm dividing by a negative. I'm dividing by negative 10. So my symbol, for first of all, 30 divided by negative 10 is negative 3. And then my symbol is going to change directions. Anytime you're multiplying or dividing by a negative, your symbol changes directions. Have to make sure you flip your symbol, because on the bottom we're dividing by a negative 10. And then over here I'm going to add 2. So again, same first step. I added 2 on this side. I'm going to add 2 on this side. I'm left with negative 10m greater than or equal to negative 5. And then I have to divide by negative 10. And because I'm dividing by a negative 10 on the bottom, my symbol is also going to flip. It's going to keep the line underneath, but it's going to flip. And then this time, you could just type that into your calculator. 5 divided by 10 is going to be 1/2. And it's going to be positive 1/2 because a negative divided by a negative is a positive. So again, you have to look at your two numbers. You know you have an and in between, because a big inequality with two inequality symbols is an and compound inequality. Then you have to look back through and say, okay, which one is smaller? Well, negative 3 is smaller than 1/2. So my final answer is going to be written like this. It's going to be negative 3, then I put 1/2. The variable that they use is m, so that goes in the middle. Symbols always going that way. And then I look back through, and it looks like at 1/2, the line is underneath. So this right here is my final answer. Then I go and graph it. At negative 3, which would be right in between negative 4 and negative 2, I have an open circle because there's no line underneath. Then 1/2, here's 1, so 1/2 would be here. It's a closed circle. I'm shading in between those two. So not quite at 1, in between 0 and 1. So my interval notation is just simply negative 3 with a parenthesis because it's an open circle, or it's a less than, to 1/2, but the 1/2 needs a bracket. And that is how you solve a compound inequality, specifically the and type.